Hello and welcome to our webinar. This week, Infrastructure Victoria launched the draft 30-year strategy for Victoria. We're going to run you through some of the recommendations today. My name is Jill Riseley. I'm the Deputy CEO here at Infrastructure Victoria, and I'm joined by our CEO, Dr. Jonathan Spear. Jonathan and I join you this morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners here and on country throughout Victoria and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'll start with a little bit of housekeeping. We have an opportunity for people to ask questions through Slido. The Slido link can be found below the live stream on our website. There you'll also find a link that you can view the webinar in closed captions. For those of you who don't know Infrastructure Victoria, we are the state's independent advisory body. We have three core main functions. One is to conduct independent research on infrastructure issues. We also provide independent advice to government on infrastructure matters. And we also produce a 30-year infrastructure strategy, which we update every 3 to 5 years. And we'll take you through our new draft strategy today. In terms of the timeline for our 30-year infrastructure strategy, the first strategy was released in 2016. We then revised and published an update in 2021. And now we're launching our new draft. And between now and the 28th of April, you'll have the opportunity to provide your feedback through consultation. Towards the end of this year, we will be tabling the final strategy in Parliament. This strategy has 43 draft recommendations and 7 draft future options. And Jonathan's going to take you through some of them in a moment. 18,500 Victorians were engaged throughout the development of this draft strategy. And as I mentioned, you can have your say now until Monday, the 28th of April. This strategy intends to provide advice to the Victorian Government and provide some direction around a wide range of infrastructure options. This includes transport, health, social infrastructure, the environment, and many other aspects. Jonathan, I'll hand over to you so you can take us through some of those key recommendations.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jill. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us for this webinar. It's great to see so much interest that there's been in the draft strategy. As Jill said, I'm going to take you through a relatively rapid tour of the recommendations and the options that we've identified as well. They're out for consultation at the moment, so we're really looking forward to you having your say. I'm going to take you through relatively quickly because we could probably do a webinar on every one of the recommendations that we've got. But what you'll be able to do hopefully is ask some questions in the Slido function about any particular areas that you're interested in that you want to dive deeper on. And of course, all the information's all there in the draft strategy that's on our website currently too. So to start with, the strategy is organised around objectives because infrastructure doesn't exist just for itself. It exists to achieve outcomes that we want as a society in Victoria. And in 2023, we had quite a long process of engaging with hundreds of Victorians about the future that they want to see in Victoria and the role that infrastructure plays in achieving those outcomes. And in addition to more than 500 Victorians from across the state, we actually engaged with a group of young people because, let's face it, a 30-year strategy is one in which young people have got more to gain from us getting this right. And so we spent a lot of time talking to them about their aspirations for the future and the role of infrastructure. What that brought us to is these objectives that you can see on the screen now for the strategy. So it's things like having good access to housing and jobs and services, our economy being productive and a circular economy, the resilience that we have in our community to climate change and other risks, while also making sure that we've got a thriving natural environment. We want infrastructure to contribute to Victorians being healthy and safe, and we want it to contribute to self-determination of Aboriginal people and achieving the objectives of closing the gap in outcomes for Aboriginal people. So what you'll see as you go through this strategy is organised in accordance with these objectives. And many of the recommendations actually help contribute to achieving multiple of these objectives. But we've really put each of the recommendations under the one that we think is the most relevant of the objectives it's trying to achieve. So, for example, we have the objective of Victorians having good access to housing, jobs, services and opportunities. And under that objective, then there is a number of recommendations that help to achieve that. So the first recommendation we've got is to continue a program of building more social housing over the next 15 years. And when you dive into the strategy, you'll see that each of the recommendations is a headline and the main body of the recommendation. And that's the thing that we're really saying to the Victorian Government. This is the recommendation in draft at the moment, but this is the recommendation that the Victorian Government will be required to respond to when the strategy is tabled in Parliament at the end of the year. So you'll then see more information about why we think each one of these recommendations is important and how it will achieve the objective that we've identified, and some detail about how we think it could be implemented, and a sense of the costs and ways in which the delivery of the objective and the recommendation may occur. So in addition to the social housing recommendation, then we have a cluster of recommendations regarding social infrastructure. So the need for more kindergartens and schools and TAFEs as our population grows, and quite specific advice about the places in which that's most likely to be needed, a lot of which is in the growth areas of Melbourne and some of our regional cities, but also smart ways in which the government can make sure it delivers that educational infrastructure in the most efficient way, while still getting it to the communities that need it in the time that they do. A similar principle applies to a recommendation on building libraries and aquatic centres in Melbourne's growth areas. We've identified opportunities for the state to partner with the Australian and local governments in meeting those needs for particularly growing and young communities in the growth areas of our cities. And we've continued to call for investment to make infrastructure more accessible, particularly some of the upgrades to our tram infrastructure and the tram stops, but also so government buildings are more accessible. Then we move, still under this accessibility objective, to a number of housing related recommendations. So for those of you who are friends of the show and have been following along with Infrastructure Victoria's work over years, you'll know that we've had a lot to say about the relationship between the location of housing and best use of the infrastructure we have now or in the future. And so that theme comes out throughout the strategy in a number of ways, particularly under this objective. So we're continuing to call for more homes to be located in areas near existing infrastructure. And so that involves rezoning those really good locations to give more home choices for people. And then we have a couple of future options. So Jill said earlier there's 43 recommendations and 7 future options. Now future options are things that we're saying to the government, you don't necessarily have to deliver this in the next 5 years. Unlike the rest of the recommendations in the strategy where we're saying, look, these are the highest priority things you've really got to get going on. The future options are rather things that we think government needs to have on its radar to set ourselves well up for the next 30 years. So it's things like thinking about mandating more affordable homes near existing infrastructure as part of that rezoning that might occur. Or phasing out residential stamp duties. You've probably seen there's been quite a lot of coverage of this issue in the media recently on the back of our work and the work of others as well. And so the thing we're pointing out here is that if we start to phase out stamp duties over time, that will actually help people with greater housing choices and better use of infrastructure in places where it is already being delivered. So then the strategy moves on to a number of recommendations around transport. So we're calling for more extension of tram services in existing suburbs of Melbourne. Places like Fisherman's Bend and Arden, but also the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And while this will have some good transport benefits, one of our big areas of focus on this has been around the way in which extending tram zones, tram lines and rezoning will actually uplift the amount of housing around those tram lines as well and give more housing choice. We've got a number of bus-related recommendations, and again, if you've followed IV's work over recent years, you'll know we've had quite a lot to say about the opportunity for better bus services. So we're calling for running of faster bus services more often in Victoria's largest cities. So Melbourne, but also our big regional cities as well, really have a need for better bus services. And we've identified something new for Melbourne, but not in other cities, and that is the opportunity to deliver bus rapid transit networks. So that is dedicated corridors for high quality, high frequency buses that give a really good metro transport option at a fraction of the cost and the time it would take to deliver, say, a new railway route. And we've identified a lot of places in the middle suburbs of Melbourne in particular where that might be a big opportunity. Still staying on transport, we've called for extension of metropolitan trains to run more services in Melbourne's west. So that's electrification of the trains towards Melton, as well as some new stations in those growth areas, but also that freeing up of some of the pathways to deliver more regional V-line trains, which will give benefits both to the growth areas of Melbourne, but also to regional travellers too. Speaking of regional travellers, we're recommending that more bus and coach services be run in regional Victoria, in particular to connect up some of our bigger regional cities with the towns in between, to give people more access to jobs and services and education. And last but not least, under this objective, we're calling for reform of fares, in particular that people pay a lower fare when they travel off-peak, because we know that will enable more people to travel off-peak on our public transport system, which reduces demand on the system, reduces demand on our roads as well, because more people will travel on public transport, and is much fairer. And there's opportunities to simplify regional fares too. Okay, so the next objective then in the strategy we talk about is the role that infrastructure can play in making Victorians, healthier and safer. One of the big areas of focus when we released the strategy is our recommendation number 14, to make local streets safer for children and communities. So what we've done in this recommendation is call for lowering of speed limits in local streets. So some of those local streets, not arterial roads, not the sort of 60 km/h on arterial roads. We're talking local streets where many of us will walk or cycle or play, and we are recommending that where there's 50 km/h zones, they lower to 30 km/h. And not only will it make that safer for everybody, but in particular it will allow communities to be feeling much more confident about taking active transport around their local communities. And we've recommended that the focus of this begin in places where children play more often, so around kindergartens, schools and parks. I've got a funny feeling we might come back to that when we come to the Q&A, because there's certainly been lots of interest in this recommendation. The other thing we've recommended is to continue to build safe cycling networks in Melbourne and our regional cities. So we have a strategic cycling corridor network that's been identified already, but it hasn't all been built out yet with safe separated cycling lanes. So that's what that recommendation is about. We're also recommending that more open space be provided for growing communities by making better use of the school grounds we have on our government schools. This is research actually that we published last year, and we're reiterating it in this strategy, the real opportunity to give better access to open space in our local communities by making better use of our school grounds. Speaking of better use, we are recommending there be investment in maintenance and upgrades and expansions of our community health facilities that we have in our local communities, and that then takes us on to a suite of recommendations that the strategy makes in relation to the health system. So we're recommending building more residential alcohol and drug treatment facilities, and we've identified particular areas of regional Victoria where there are not enough of those to meet the needs of the communities there. We're recommending continued investment in digital healthcare, which has big productivity benefits for the health system, but again for regional Victorians, it can deliver much better services, particularly if we can start to have things like radiology move on to a digital health system. Some of our big public hospitals, so places like Royal Melbourne Hospital, the Alfred and the Austin, play a core statewide role in the system. And we know that those facilities are in need of upgrading and some rebuilds in some locations. And so that's what one of the things we're recommending is the continued investment in the Royal Melbourne, the Alfred and the Austin Hospital and their upgrades. And we make a recommendation around the justice system, particularly the way in which prisoners are accommodated in the new prisons that we've been building and the health and housing needs that they have. We're recommending that with the new capacity that's been built, that prisoners be located in prisons that are best suited to their needs, to addressing their needs, which are often underlying conditions that are causing their offending. We're recommending more health facilities be delivered in prisons and more transitional housing for when prisoners are leaving custodial settings, which we know there's good evidence that reduces reoffending. Okay, so the next objective, I should say, is around Aboriginal people having self-determination and equal outcomes to other Victorians. This is an objective that Infrastructure Victoria partnered with a large number of Aboriginal and other First Nations peak bodies to get their feedback in creating this objective. And it really recognises a couple of elements. So one is the role that infrastructure investment can have in helping to further the self-determination of Aboriginal people, but also the role that infrastructure can have in getting better outcomes and more equal life outcomes for Aboriginal people. Now, there's a number of recommendations in the strategy that will actually contribute to this outcome. There's two in particular that sit under this objective I'd like to draw your attention to. So one is around housing. So we have recommended continued investment in secure homes for Aboriginal Victorians, combined with investment in building the capacity of the housing sector to promote that too. Similarly, there's really opportunities to better fund the wellbeing infrastructure, the health and wellbeing infrastructure for Aboriginal Victorians. So what this recommendation is looking at is the need to upgrade, often quite dilapidated, Aboriginal community health infrastructure across the state, to address some of the maintenance deficits and to set up more ongoing funding and investment so that there can be some predictability in the Victorian Aboriginal community health model, which is good evidence, gives better outcomes for Aboriginal people. The next objective is Victoria having a thriving natural environment. And of course, infrastructure has a role to play in this. There's a first recommendation in this section looks at the emissions that are embodied and enabled by the infrastructure that we build. And again, if you've followed Infrastructure Victoria's work, you'll know that we and also other places around Australia, particularly New South Wales, have been doing work on ways in which we can better count carbon that's embodied in the infrastructure that we build. And by counting it, we can then start to seek to reduce it. And so that means that over the build and life of our infrastructure, we're not embedding so much emissions in it, and probably delivering infrastructure more cheaply and more productively as well. We've then got a recommendation and a future option related to the water sector. So we are recommending that there be further investment in integrated water management and use of more recycled water. So there is real opportunities for us to make sure we get the most of all water sources that we have in Victoria, and that not a drop goes to waste. And some of that we can use through integrated water management in our parks and gardens and agriculturally as well. And there is going to be a need for us to continue to have more focus on recycling water and testing the degree to which that is both going to meet the health and engineering and economic requirements that we have in Victoria. Then we have another one of these future options, not a thing that we think the government needs to be building right now, but over coming decades, we're going to need to plan for and invest in more manufactured water. So that's things like large recycling of water and desalination plants, because we know we're going to have hotter, drier conditions combined with increased population, which will draw upon the water that we need. So now is the time to plan for those upgrades to manufactured water plants that we will need. And then the last of the recommendations we have under this objective is better use of government land for open space and greenery. So there's big opportunities to make sure that the government land that we have is better connected so that communities can use it for travel and for play and recreation. And that we're making use of all the open space we have, particularly in our growing cities as our population grows as well. And there's been good improvements recently for targeting of improved tree canopy cover and requirements on private land. We'd like to see that matched by increased tree canopy on public land as well. The next objective is for Victoria to be resilient to climate change and other future risks. And we've got a couple of recommendations then to start with that get to that resilience, that adaptation to the more frequent and severe weather events that we're already experiencing, and that a lot of the science and modelling shows we're likely to continue to experience. So we're recommending that we better prepare for climate change with our infrastructure by making investments in the highest return on investment adaptations to our infrastructure so that it is more resilient to more frequent and severe weather events. The other thing we're recommending is that there be updates to flood mapping, both floods around rivers, but also flood inundation that might happen on our coasts. That be updated and then integrated into our planning scheme so that everybody knows where there's likely to be future flood risk. And just like we've done with bushfire zones, everybody has greater clarity about where we can be building and where we should be avoiding building because of future flood risk. Then we have a number of recommendations related to the energy transition. And this is underpinned by some new reports and evidence that we've published as well as part of this work that's looked at some of the future risks to the transition and the scenarios that might occur as we go through the energy transition. We've identified the need to better coordinate faster delivery of the key energy infrastructure projects we need to be delivering, and also some of the non-energy infrastructure that underpins that. Things like the transport infrastructure we're going to need to get the new energy infrastructure built. We're recommending there be improvements to environmental assessments and site selection for energy projects. We're also recommending investments in batteries at the home, neighbourhood and big battery level. This will both deliver better benefits for households, better returns to households from the big investments that many of us have made across the community in solar power on our rooftops. But one of the other things that we can get with bigger batteries being used is a lower demand on the electricity transmission network, which of course is one of the key elements of the big energy build we need to make. But batteries can give us a little bit of a buffer as to the demand we have on those transition networks. Another component of this is the need for further examination of what the long duration energy storage needs there are in Victoria as we move to a more renewable system. And then we've got a couple more recommendations related to energy. One looks at the mix of energy that each region is going to need and the role that gas is going to play in Victoria in future. And so we're calling for more detailed regional energy planning, that there be a close examination of the needs for supply of gas in the short run, while there be a longer run meeting of the need that particularly industry has for gas and peaking of power needs for gas, while also planning for reduced demand for gas by many households in the future. And one of the things that's likely to drive that and give lots of benefits to households is speeding up of energy efficiency and electrification of households. So we've recommended a number of initiatives in our recommendations, number 34 here. So continued focus on social and affordable housing, having higher energy efficiency in particular, but also that as old gas appliances for things like heating of our rooms and heating of our hot water come to the end of their life, that they be replaced by efficient electric heat pump appliances, and also that there be greater disclosure of the energy efficiency of homes at the time that they come up for sale or lease, so that people who are purchasing or renting have got a greater sense of what it's going to be like to live in those homes and the cost of running them. So last but not least, we have an objective in relation to Victoria having a high productivity and circular economy. So there is a recommendation number 35, which is a really all-encompassing recommendation that looks across lots of sectors, because what this recommendation is talking about is that there are big benefits in us having a common set of assumptions about the future population and jobs and land use patterns that we want to be achieving as a state. And of course, Plan for Victoria was recently released by the government, and that starts to give us a bit of a steer as to some of the future layout of our population and jobs. And Infrastructure Victoria's work in the past has shown that if we can have more compact cities, that will get us better social, economic and environmental outcomes. So this recommendation is all about setting a common set of assumptions for population and jobs and land use, and then making sure that our infrastructure and service plans are actually all lined up to achieve that objective and provide our populations with the infrastructure and the services they need over time. One of the ways we're going to need to do that is to reform our infrastructure contributions. So at the moment, there's a bit of a patchwork of the way in which developers have to contribute to the infrastructure that growing communities need. We've identified opportunities to make that more broad-based, but also simpler and more predictable, so that communities have a contribution towards their infrastructure as they grow, regardless of the setting of that growth. Then when it comes to productivity, which is one of the big objectives of this recommendation, or this objective I should say, We've got a recommendation to improve asset management of all government infrastructure. So a lot of the infrastructure we've got now is the infrastructure we're going to have over coming decades. There are real opportunities to make sure that the asset management systems we've got, the information about where that infrastructure is, its quality and condition and how and when it needs to be maintained, that be updated. And we actually invest in that information and capability so that when we spend our maintenance money, we're spending it smarter and more productively. We've also got a recommendation about recycling and waste infrastructure. And what this is about is making sure that when we're doing our land use planning and also planning for economic growth in particular precincts, that lines up well and very clearly with where we want to have future waste and recycling infrastructure. Then we've got a couple of recommendations about digital technology. So some of this is AI, but it's not all AI. There's a whole lot of digital technologies that are out there that can give us better use and more productive use of the infrastructure that we have or are building. And so we're calling for the government to use digital technologies more to build, design, maintain and operate the infrastructure that we have. And a really good example of that is the way in which we manage our roads. There are digital road management systems that allow us to do things like controlling the traffic lights to help with the flow on arterial roads, or better manage the flow on our freeways. And we're calling for that to be rolled out more broadly across Melbourne, but also our regional cities where we're seeing more congestion occurring as well. We then have a number of other recommendations and future options that are related to freight and transport, and some of those sort of bigger projects that people have got on their minds. So we're talking about future options to charge people more fairly to use the roads. So that goes all the way from parking charges to what the way forward might be for distance-based charging of electric vehicles, which the Victorian Government might partner with the Australian Government on resolving that issue. But that's not something we're saying the government needs to be doing right now, but as we have growing congestion in future years, we think that all the options for charging people more fairly to use our roads should remain on the table. We're recommending there be opportunities for more productive freight system. So there'd be greater clarity about the long-term plan for our regional and metro rail freight and more investment so that users of that freight system can have confidence about the way it's going to be developed and maintained. And we know from our modelling and from what industry have told us that delivering freight off-peak is going to be increasingly important if the freight system is going to operate productively. So we're calling for encouragement and piloting of off-peak freight deliveries, which subject to the outcomes of that could be made more mainstream. And there's a future option we've identified because we're seeing it happen in other cities where they are designating zones where more efficient and sustainable freight gets priority for access to those zones, and it's often places around ports or other big high demand areas where we can give preferential access to low emissions or higher productivity vehicles that are getting in and out of our cities and making our freight work more productively. Now, recommendation number 43 is one that lots of people are going to be interested in because that's where a bunch of the big ticket items sit that many people are interested in. So we are recommending that there be planning done over the next 5 years to set ourselves up well over the following decades for delivery of some of those big infrastructure projects that people have got in their minds. So what am I talking about there? I've touched on one earlier about the need for being prepared for more desalination and manufactured water plants. But it's also preparing for a future second port at Bay West and things like extension of our metropolitan railway lines to the north and the southeast of Melbourne. It's the city loop reconfiguration. It's the outer metropolitan ring road and the West Intermodal Freight Terminal. So a number of these big projects, we are recommending that government do good planning for, preserve corridors, do environmental assessments in the next 5 years. We're not recommending they be built in the next 5 years, but rather that preparations be done for them. We go into a little bit more information and detail about a couple of these projects. The city loop reconfiguration and also the extension of metropolitan trains to the north and the southeast of Melbourne, because we think that after the investment in the west that we've recommended happen as a priority out towards Melton, that there are a couple more that have got really big benefits that we could have to how the whole of the Melbourne works, and actually the way in which regional Victorians interact with Melbourne too. So that's all of the draft recommendations and the 7 future options we've identified. I'm going to hand back to Jill now, who will take you through a bit more of the detail about the consultation process, and I'm really looking forward to some of your questions, so keep them coming. And also I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback as we go towards finalising the strategy. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Jonathan. We've covered a lot of ground there, 43 recommendations and 7 options, which provide a really practical roadmap for the Victorian Government over the next 5 to 30 years. But as Jonathan mentioned, we are really keen to get your feedback, both by asking questions today, and you can ask those questions using the Slido link below the live stream, but also to get your feedback on the consultation. So I'll take you through the next steps, but also how you can provide some feedback. So over the coming months, from now until the end of April, you'll be invited to provide some feedback to us through the Engage Vic website. And we'll provide a QR code for you in a moment, and you can go there directly, or you can go to the Engage Vic website and simply put in Infrastructure Victoria 30-year strategy. After the consultation closes on the 28th of April, our team will get to work looking at all those submissions, collating that feedback, but also doing some additional work, some additional research if needed, some additional modelling, but also refining the costings and the timeframes around those recommendations. So that will take place between May and October. We then hope to table the final strategy in Parliament at the end of 2025. But we want to hear from you. So we'd love to hear your view on the recommendations, some specific feedback. So what recommendations do you like? What recommendations don't you like? Should there be additional recommendations? And really helping us by providing some specifics around what you think should be included and any evidence or case studies that you may have around that. The timing of recommendations, removing or changing some of those recommendations, the costings, the timeframes, things that you think should be prioritised, or things that potentially you think we've got on the list that you don't think is a priority for the government, particularly in the next 5 to 30 years. We're also really open to hearing any additional context or framing that you might be able to provide in the finalisation of our strategy. Over the coming months, we'll also be holding a number of public information sessions, but also meeting with industry and stakeholders through forums and workshops. But as I mentioned, we're really keen to hear from you, both today, but also having your say via the Engage Vic website. So you'll see a QR code there on the screen. That will take you straight through to the landing page on the Engage Vic website. The entire strategy is there, including any of the underlying research and technical documents that you can review. You can look at regions, you can look by topics, you can dive into things that really interest you, or you can go through the entire strategy and the entire recommendation and all 43 recommendations and 7 options. From there, we'd love you to prepare some feedback. You can download our submission form and fill that out, again providing as much detail as you can and any supporting evidence or case studies. And then we really encourage you to upload your submission and make sure that you do that by the 28th of April, which is when our consultation will close. But let's hear from you now. We'd love to hear your questions using the Slido link that is below the live stream on the website. And Jonathan, I suspect we'll have quite a few questions. There's a couple of areas in particular that we suspect we will see a focus. There's been a lot of talk around the 30-kilometre speed limit in local areas. Given that that has been a hot topic, I know we've had a number of family and friends that have contacted me, very supportive, or a couple of questions. Do you want to talk us through a little bit around the safety benefits of the 30 kilometres in local streets?
Yeah, really happy to, Jill. And look, I've made the front page of The Age and lots of TV, and we weren't necessarily surprised that people were very engaged in this recommendation, we think it's got a lot of opportunity. And so the first thing I should probably do is be very clear about what we are and are not recommending, because I think there might have been some misinterpretation on some of the reporting. So we're not talking about every road across Victoria going to 30 kilometres an hour. We're not talking about every road in the cities. We are talking about local streets. So some of those local streets are often the ones that councils are responsible for. So it's not arterial roads, it's not busy roads where we've got public transport or trucks going up and down or people using it as key arterials to get around the city. We're talking here about local streets. And we know that there's actually very low levels of active transport used around our communities, and a real drop, particularly in children going to school by walking or cycling. And the thing that parents often lament is the school run and having to load the kids up and drop them for relatively short distances. So that's partly what we're on about here. As much about safety, we're looking at things like being able to have people use active transport more. So we're recommending that many of those local streets that currently have a kind of standard 50 kilometre hour as the sort of state government policy go to a standard of 30 kilometres an hour. Now, it's probably not going to be possible to do everything everywhere all at once when it comes to dropping from 50 to 30. So rather, we're recommending that be targeted in the first instance at places that children often play or are around. So kindergarten, schools, parks, those sorts of places. The data and the evidence about the difference that this will make to safety is really powerful. So if you get hit by a vehicle at 50 kilometres an hour, then you've got around an 85% chance of dying. If you get hit by a vehicle at 30 kilometres an hour, you've got around a 10% chance of dying. So there's really big road safety opportunities here, because we're having hundreds of children injured every year, often as pedestrians on local streets. And a handful of them, sort of 7, I think, is the number in the last year, are dying, and many of those are dying in accidents where they are pedestrians. So that's the road safety benefit. The other thing that comes up a lot is a lot of people saying, "Oh, but it means that it'll be so much slower for us to get around." Well, it's interesting because Monash University have done some good research on this, and what they found is actually going from 50 to 30 kilometres an hour in local streets is not going to make much difference at all to how long it takes us to get around. And actually, intuitively, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because we'll need to be, stopping at corners or at traffic lights and things like that. And your end-to-end journey in a city, either be it Melbourne or our regional cities, usually means that you do have to start and stop a bit. So we've got some really big road safety benefits. We've got some really big active transport and lifestyle benefits, and just our local neighbourhoods being more pleasant places to be. And in reality, probably not the reduction in travel times that people are really concerned about.
Thanks, Jonathan. Housing has also been a really hot topic.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Julie on how the community ensure that the state government builds 4,000 social homes annually for the next 15 years. We've had a lot of focus on social housing by the government over the last few years, but how do we ensure that continues?
Yeah. So great question. So I'm pleased to say that since our first strategy in 2016, which Jill was talking earlier about, the 2016-2021 strategy, and now the update we're doing, we've always recommended to government that there be increases in social housing, and we consider social housing to be a form of infrastructure. And that has been met by the big housing bill that the government has had over recent years. What we're recommending is that there be a consistent program of investment, and that's one of the important parts about how there can be some ensuring of delivery. So if there is starting and stopping of the aspiration and of the funding, then we know that is going to get us a less certain and probably a more expensive result than there being a consistent program of investment where you have a range of providers doing it too. So you have Homes Victoria, but also community housing providers and some other private and not-for-profit providers. Because the scale of the task is so big that we think that there needs to be a long-term program of investment. What we've recommended in the draft strategy is that 15-year program then deliver about 60,000 social homes. That we know will meet some but not all of the demand that there is for safe, secure housing. But doing it programmatically means that there will be better use of the resources we have, the ability to learn and iterate and make savings, and also to more consistently make better use of government land, which is one of the big savings opportunities and delivery opportunities that we have for social housing in coming decades.
And Infrastructure Victoria's had quite a lot to say over the last few years and done a lot of research into compact cities and the livability of cities. We have a question around how the strategy supports the idea of 15, 20 or 30-minute cities.
Yeah, it's good. So however many numbers of minutes do you think the cities might be? We have a number of recommendations that support the more compact city outcomes and better accessibility. We have not necessarily structured the strategies, recommendations or objectives around achieving a particular 15, 20 or 30-minute city outcome, right? What we have focused on is better accessibility and more choices about how people do that. And so that's about good access to jobs, but also to services and education and other activities people want to have. And it's also good housing choices as well. And so the recommendations in the strategy that look to, firstly, the longer term planning about making sure all of our infrastructure investment is pointing towards the population and jobs and land use outcome we want to have is a fundamental piece of us all pointing in the same direction to achieve more accessible cities with more housing and transport choices. Then our recommendations about rezoning places where there is good transport and other infrastructure already is another key unlocker to people having better access to housing and transport choices and good accessibility. Then the recommendations we're making on public and active transport are really helpful for that too. The tram recommendation in particular, where we're recommending tram extensions primarily because they will unlock more housing in well-located places, as well as giving improvements to the public transport network, is an example of that. As is things like lower speeds on local streets, because it makes it more feasible for people to walk or cycle around their local areas. So that really goes all through the strategy, and it's as simple as things like opening up our local schools so that people got open space nearby, and making sure our government land is well connected for people to use and has good tree canopy as well. So taken together, those recommendations really make our cities, both Melbourne but also our regional cities and towns, much more accessible, much more housing choice, better places to get around, and just much nicer places to be.
Thanks, Jonathan. There's always a lot of interest and focus on public transport.
Yes.
And access to public transport. The government's made a number of really significant investments and announcements over the last 5-10 years into public transport, including the suburban rail loop.
Yes.
And we have a question around to what extent the strategy factors in the proposed suburban rail loop, and does it consider to provide a significant upgrade to bus services to the destinations that might be serviced by the new suburban rail loop?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we've had a decade, of course, which we haven't quite finished, of a number of very big projects that are underway, the transport projects. So suburban rail loop is one that the government has in train, but also the Metro, Melbourne Metro, the Westgate Tunnel, and of course North East Link are underway, as well as lots of level crossing removal. So it's been a lot of big build, and everyone in Victoria kind of has seen that. What this strategy does is it looks at how do we make the most of that big build that we've invested in, and how do we fill in some of the gaps that exist. And so that's one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of like really big transport projects in the recommendations for what needs to be done in the next 5 years in this draft strategy. Probably the biggest one is that electrification of rail services in the West and improvements in the West. But otherwise, much of what we're recommending is about optimising the system that we have in place, and improving some of the way in which we get connections between bits of that system. So many of our bus recommendations around that. So making our existing bus services more direct and faster and more frequent means that in our existing suburbs, including places where there's going to be suburban rail loop, but also the Metro Tunnel opening, there's real opportunities that we've identified for bus and some of the tram extensions to really optimise the way in which people get to and use those services. The recommendation around bus rapid transit services also fills in a range of gaps we have in our transport system, particularly in our middle and outer suburbs, and connects up activity centres and rail lines so we get much more for people living in those areas. And of course we've called for more bus services delivered in our growth areas too. So that's very much the theme, as is things like off-peak public transport fares, so that more people use the public transport network that we've had this big investment in, which takes pressure off the roads, but also means that we don't need to be designing and upgrading the system as quickly to meet a peak demand, because more people travel more spread across the day. So the strategy is calling for sort of lots of ways in which we can maximise that investment that we've got now and is planned into the future.
Thanks, Jonathan. You mentioned the rail electrification in the West.
Yeah.
And it would be great if you could expand a little bit more on that, because there's additional benefits just to the electrification.
Yeah, there certainly are. Yes. So we've done some transport modelling, which is and as is Infrastructure Victoria's way, we're very transparent about this. So the transport modelling report is there on our website for you to have a look at if you'd like to sort of dig into the depths of it. But we have had very significant growth in Melbourne's west in recent decades, and when you look at the trajectory that's on and the housing targets that have been announced, we're looking at continued growth being planned in Milton, but also in other areas of Western Melbourne. And so what that then translates to, when you do the transport modelling, is very significant demand for both roads and public transport use, and very significant congestion and crowding if we don't do something about that. So that's why we're recommending as a priority that there be investment in the West in a number of ways. It's not just about trains. We're recommending across all modes that there be improvements, but the electrification to Melton means that we can give metro rail services instead of V-line services to Melton, and we can also run those trains more frequently with the services, but also deliver some train stations in some of those areas where there is a lot of growth and a lot of demand. The benefit that also has is that it frees up some of the demand and some of the trains that we have that we would otherwise be running on Melton. We can run on lines like Wyndham Vale, which gives benefits to other commuters from Melbourne's west, but also regional commuters who are coming in from other parts of the state. Because it means we've got then less congestion and greater capacity coming in through the west. The other thing I should mention is we've recommended an opportunity for a new train station in Altona West. And that's less about the big demand and more about housing opportunity. So, that's an activity centre that's been identified. And what our modelling shows is if we put a new station in Altona West, that'll unlock a lot of housing and jobs in that location.
And Jonathan, you mentioned and acknowledged there's been a really significant investment in infrastructure over the last 10 years. We have a question about the affordability of the strategy given Victoria's current financial position. Are you able to talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a really high priority for us in putting the strategy together and in doing the strategic level costings that we always do for every strategy that we do. We look at ballpark, what would it cost the Victorian Government to deliver and to run any one of the recommendations that we've made. So we have estimated that the delivery of the 43 recommendations would cost between $60 and $70 million roughly. And that's spread out over sort of 10 to 15 years. So it's from 2026 through into the 2030s. And then what we've looked at is what would be the other contributions that are likely to be made to delivering those recommendations. So we've taken into account things like contributions that the Commonwealth Government might make to projects, that private or not-for-profit organisations might make to some of the particular social infrastructure that we've recommended. And also the ability to reduce the land costs, which can be a big component of infrastructure, and that will often involve smart and very kind of programmatic use of Victorian Government land, so that we're making savings instead of having to buy that land and pay the full market price for it. So if we do that, the cost of delivering the strategy gets down to about $55 billion over the next decade or so. And that clocks out then to about $5 billion a year. Now, when you look at the totality of what the Victorian Government has been spending on infrastructure in recent years and is projected to spend, $5 billion is a very small proportion of that. So we've been at peaks of about $20 billion of infrastructure spending and capital spending in recent years. Now, the government's indicated in its budget papers that it's intending to reduce that down into the sort of teens. And you can see that in the 4 projections in the budget papers. So this is a very financially responsible strategy because, as I said earlier, while there are some capital investments that are big that we're recommending, a lot of it is about how we make better use of the infrastructure we've got. What are smart investments we can make that might be smaller in scale but get more out of the networks that we've got? Or how do we spend our money smarter? So what I mean by that is we're probably going to have to spend money on schools and kindergartens and TAFEs and probably social housing too over coming decades. What our recommendations are about is where to target that money and smart ways to deliver it so we get the best value for the community and for the taxpayer. So that's very much the focus that we've got. Many of our recommendations don't involve capital spending. They're policy reforms, or there's some technology investments, or changes to the way we do things. The big ticket items in the strategy is our call for continued investment in social housing as a program over the next 15 years. Investment in the extension of electrification of rail to the west, tram extensions and some of the bus rapid transit networks, and then delivering more schools, more kindergartens, and upgrading our big tertiary hospitals. Those costs are going to be in the billions of dollars. But there's only a handful that are at that cost. We think that they are really meeting high priority needs that the community has, and are very much affordable when you look at the capacity of the state budget with contributions from others and spread over the next decade or so.
And I think you mentioned before, Jonathan, as well, about some of the recommendations also unlocking investment from other sectors.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the federal government, also the kindergartens with private investment and investment from the not-for-profit sector.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things that we often hear from lots of stakeholders is if the Victorian Government can be clear about its priorities, both in land use and infrastructure planning, then what that does is it gives private and not-for-profit organisations and local government greater degree of clarity about where it can be investing to. And schools and kindergartens are a great example of that. Many of our recommendations call out that if a state government can be clear about where it's delivering schools and kindergartens, then what that can do is give clarity to other investors about where they go. So in schools, we've identified in particular a need for more state government schools to be delivered in the growth areas of Melbourne, and also some upgrades to the size of existing schools in our regional cities. So if the state government can be clear about that, that means that other school providers can then know that and deliver their planning for their schools accordingly. Similarly, with kindergartens, we know that the scale of investment for kindergartens over the next sort of couple of decades is between $10 and $20 billion. It's a big number, but it's not all about the Victorian Government delivering that, because private providers, local governments, not-for-profits, and the Victorian Government all have a role in delivering kindergarten infrastructure. So if the Victorian Government can be clear about where it's going to invest and make sure it invests particularly in places that most need kindergartens but that the private and not-for-profit market is less likely to go, some of those childcare deserts that we know exist in some areas of the state, then that frees up and gives clarity for other investors about where they can go to deliver, kindergarten services over the next decade or so.
Thanks, Jonathan. For those watching on the live stream, we are going to run for another 10 minutes to answer more of your questions. We have a question from Tom around the mechanisms being considered to secure investment in housing, and where that new infrastructure is being considered or planned. So I think you've mentioned certainly unlocking some of the other areas for investment, and I guess when it comes to housing, what that might look like, particularly with compact cities and activity centres.
Yeah, it's a good question, Tom, and so the strategy touches on some of this, but this question probably connects to a lot of the other work that Infrastructure Victoria has done and published in recent years too. So, and that's, I think, one of the things when you look overall at some of the recommendations in this strategy is you'll see that some of what we're saying is new, some of it we are reiterating very deeply researched work that Infrastructure Victoria has previously published, right? And when it comes to delivering more housing for all members of the community, that's certainly where we have been at for the last couple of years. So we're recommending the greater clarity about where population and jobs and housing is going to go in the future, because we know that if we can do that and consistently plan for that for each infrastructure sector, then that helps unlock and service where more housing is going to be. We're also recommending that there be rezoning in locations with good infrastructure that exists, particularly good transport infrastructure already. We're seeing the Victorian Government make a number of announcements on that in recent years. What we have identified is there's probably more opportunity beyond the existing announcements, and things like extending some of our tram lines or delivering bus rapid transit networks. They can also help support delivery of new housing. Then outside of the recommendations in the strategy, you might be familiar with the work we've done. One is called Our Home Choices and the other is Choosing Victoria's Future. And that's recommended things like setting housing targets, rezoning a lot in areas with good transport connections, having greater clarity about the design rules and code-based approaches to approving where townhouses and apartments can go, and reforming infrastructure contributions. We haven't reiterated all of that in the strategy, in part because the Victorian Government has taken a lot of the advice that we and other stakeholders have given them in that regard and are starting to implement that through things like the Housing Statement and Plan for Victoria.
So you mentioned then, Jonathan, that the government has implemented some of our previous recommendations in the strategy. There's a great question here saying, does the government do what you say in the strategy? So maybe if you can tell us what happens after it's tabled.
Yeah, often they do. So let me tell you a bit about the process and the history of this. So this is the third time we've updated the strategy. When we finalise the strategy, having had all the feedback that you and others are going to give us, that gets tabled in Parliament for all parties to see. And so we know that every party in the Victorian Parliament uses the infrastructure strategy and the other work that IV does to inform their policies. And they don't always do exactly as we say, and we're okay with that. Our role is to be the independent advisor. We advise and government decides. But what we do find over time is that there is a very good correlation between what Infrastructure Victoria recommends and action that the government takes. Because what the government does is it responds to our recommendations with a set of responses that tells us whether or not it agrees with our recommendations, and the government is required by law to also issue its own 5-year infrastructure plan. And then what we do is track the degree to which our recommendations are implemented over time. And so one of the things we've published along with the draft strategy is a bit of a look back at 2021 and the 97 recommendations we made in 2021 and how many of those have been implemented. And I'm pleased to say that a bit over 80% of the recommendations we made in 2021 have now either been completed or are underway. So it's not a 100% hit rate, and that's okay. We understand that government won't always either agree with all the recommendations we make or get to implement them all in the time frame that it takes for us to come back and review it. But we've got a good record of government acting upon Infrastructure Victoria's advice. So that means there's a really good reason for you to get involved and have your say on the draft strategy, because we know that that'll get then used by government, both the government of the day, but all parties of the parliament when they're thinking through, well, what are their infrastructure policies going to be for the next election and beyond as well.
Thanks, Jonathan. We did have time for one last question. There was a question regarding land use planning and better integration with transport. Did you want to talk a little bit around how the strategy addresses the improved interconnectivity between growth areas, developments, particularly with the outer sprawl, and transport?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I've talked already about a lot of the way in which the transport recommendations we're making fill in a lot of the gaps and make the network work better and encourage more people to have more housing choices. And that's a key thing that runs through the strategy. The other two things I probably haven't talked about so much is the particular needs of growth areas and also regional Victoria as well. Because this is Victoria's infrastructure strategy, not Melbourne's infrastructure strategy. It's a statewide strategy, and many of our recommendations apply all across the state. And we are seeing growth in populations at the edges of Melbourne, certainly, in the north, the west and the southeast of Melbourne. And so a lot of our recommendations are around improving the transport, but also the social infrastructure and things like parks and tree canopy that we know growing communities need in those areas. But the same applies in our regional cities and towns as well. So we know that there's a real need for improved public transport services and social infrastructure in the growing parts of our regional cities. And we've made particular recommendations about that, especially improvements of bus services in our regional cities as well, and the connections between those cities with coach services. But a lot of our planning recommendations and the integration of planning and land use apply for regional cities too. So for those of you who are in regional Victoria, we'd love to hear from you about whether this resonates for you and it addresses the needs that you have. It's certainly a real focus that we've had in this update of the strategy.
Thanks, Jonathan. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. A big thank you to you for running us through those recommendations and answering those questions. And a big thank you to everyone who's watching the webinar on the live stream. You will, as with all our webinars, receive a quick poll after the webinar. And please answer that. It really does help us and inform us on future webinars and what you'd like to hear from us on. There's lots more information both on the strategy, also our past research and Infrastructure Victoria more broadly on our website. So you can visit us there at www.infrastructurevictoria.com.au. As mentioned, we are really keen to hear from you, so please hop onto the Engage Vic website and make a submission. Feel free to contact us as well if you need help with making a submission. You've got our contact details there, and feel free to follow us also on social media. But that's all we've got time for. Thank you again, and goodbye.